Hey Joe, this is Mike. Can you hear me over? Hey Mike, this is Joe. I've got Lima Charlie. How you me? Over. I've got Lima Charlie. Break. You hear about this Joe with the hot mic? Over. No dude, I've got the Joe on. Let me pour a cup and give you the some. Over. Roger that. Stand by to get some.
Yeah, man, how you been doing recently?
Doing good, man. I was able to watch that. Did you watch that Senate House Armed Senate for the Armed House People? The senior military NCOs briefed to the subcommittee or whatever. You watch any clips or read those XMs? Yeah, it was pretty interesting. I mean, I watched the whole 2 hours and 15 minutes of it, which I don't know. The first 15 minutes were a standby page. I don't know who did the editing, but it definitely wasn't Mike Sadjovan. So. Yeah, I don't know, it's pretty interesting. I mean, they bring up a lot of valid concerns that we've been talking about in the military space for kind of millennia, but also especially the last 10 years or so, where it's like, hey, housing and pay and recruiting problem. And what was super interesting was the SEAC, so the DOD, Sergeant Major was like, yeah, I mean, and another thing, you just thought this guy was smoking inside because it was just all out, open kimono, without any F-bombs, but it was good because he was like, hey, there's reality, the crisis people for recruiting is I'm not even allowed, my guys can't even go into certain high schools. So you would think that every, country, every school in this country would let us come in and talk to students that might be remotely interested in the military. But reality on the line is these guys aren't allowed in there, dude. So for, both rich and poor neighborhoods kind of thing. Yeah, so it was interesting. It was also interesting because the guy from Guam, asked some questions, and one of the sergeant major, sergeant major of the army was like, I just want to start off with first we understand the importance of Guam, and I'm gonna leave it there, and which was funny. And this guy's like, yeah, we got a lot of troops there, so they want, and it was so interesting because his comment, you could tell came from Joe's or old-timey senior leaders, because he was like, yeah, their complaint is space A flights. So and he asked the sergeant major of the army, it was just, for those informed, the Air Force controls the Stratcom that manages all the airframes. And so he was like, hey, Army, what's up with the space A flights? Can we get those going? And he was like, yeah, I'll defer to Bass. I don't control the aircraft. He's like, I don't disagree with you. He's like, yeah. And, we'll get the guys some phone call dates or whatever with their family and some sort of MWR, type services. And something else was such an odd. He was like, yeah, they work in, muddy, open field, desert, hot sun conditions. So what can we do to make it more comfortable kind of thing? And I can't remember what the rebuttal was, but it was coupled to the space A question. I was like, bro, space A is not a thing since the, I don't know, 90s. Nobody flies space A, bro. Because it's just so unpredictable and et cetera. And there's only so many aircraft.
Well, this goes to show the differences in how it's discussed in the services because, yeah, it's still very much a thing. And there are people all the time that but it's
when you're
those
at air bases, sure, yeah,
but that's my point, right? Where it's for the people who are informed, then they take advantage of it because it's a resource that's available to them. And for the people that are uninformed, then they have no idea about it, or it's a ghost or a fairy tale that they hear other people talk about, but they never really understand to any certain degree. The challenge is that it's there are websites you can go to, and I forget if there's one big one for the Air Force, or if you have to go to each individual installation, each individual air base or Air Force base to see the schedule. But the schedule's only ever 24 to 72 hours in advance. So you don't get to plan months out, right? So
because it's as available, space available.
Well, yeah, but it's also who knows when this flight will get scheduled, right? Because so Transcom organizes all the mobility for all the services, and so those Transcom schedules can change at the drop of a hat, and also based on maintenance and whatever else. So anyways, the bottom line is that it is an incredibly interesting resource that's available, but you really can't, like,
plan
I always,
predictability on it.
yeah, and I always,
Yeah.
like, whenever I mentor people about it, it's like, hey, look, if you're like a single,
Yeah.
guy or gal, and you want to go see the world or whatever, or if you're a young couple and, mill or whatever, and you have a holiday, like a week of vacation or whatever coming up, like pack a bag, like a suitcase with
Yeah.
like, two sets of clothes and like a swimsuit and like hiking boots or whatever, and, like
Hmm.
kind of like random items that will get you have purpose no matter where you go. And then just like go to the passenger terminal with the mindset of we're going to take whatever's available,
Right.
understanding that you may have to pay for your return ticket home.
Right.
Because I mean, there's all manner of story. For every successful story there is about some family of 17 catching a
Yeah.
hop to like
Both
Hawaii
to and from
from,
Hawaii.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. For every story
Yeah.
there is of that happening, there's the same number of stories of people getting trapped somewhere and then either having to take like 15 different hops back home and it took
Right.
like 3 weeks, or
Yeah.
like having to pay, out of pocket like thousands of
Right.
dollars for your airfare
Yeah.
to get back on time to come back from your leave.
Yeah.
And the flights are incredibly inexpensive.
Right.
And, but again, the challenge is like the planning purpose. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, that's the kind of, I mean, that's interesting that it came up from the representative from Guam,
Yeah.
the congressman from Guam, but
Yeah.
and I'm sure like now he probably benefits from having that question on camera and like being
Sure.
able to
Sure.
show his constituents like, hey, I'm bringing this kind of stuff up, I'm fighting for you.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's one of those things like it's kind of like asking the commander, the base commander, at
Yeah.
some kind of like town hall. It's like, hey,
Right.
sir, so when are we going to add more lanes to the main road? Because it's kind of
Right.
bullshit that it's
Yeah.
a it's a 2-lane road on either side, so there's only 4 lanes of traffic total, and it's kind of bullshit. It always gets stuck. And the guy's like,
Right.
yeah, we'll take that into consideration. Like, next
Right.
question. Like,
Yeah.
like there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Or if he's like, oh, the toilet in this one building on this one floor like
Yes,
doesn't
right.
work, and you're like, bro, you're talking to the base commander. Like,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
not talking to the head of DPW even. Like, sure,
yeah,
he's his
yeah,
boss, but like, read the room, brother. Like, and they're
yeah,
like, well, have you complained to anybody? He's like, no. But like, can you fix that? It's like, yeah, but
yeah,
tonight, bro, the guy will be there. Like,
yeah.
and like,
And
bless their
now,
souls. Yeah.
but I will say there are ways that you could make that information more accessible. That's probably not a bad place to start. So,
Yeah, for
I
sure.
just mentioned that like I don't recall if it's a singular website or if it's a installation by installation
Yeah.
situation. So,
Yeah.
like right off the bat, if there was a centralized location that you could go to see,
Yeah.
um, drill down into
Uh-huh.
other installations or whatever. Um,
Yeah. The fact that there's not an app for that, or at least if there was that you don't know about it, kind of speaks to part of the problem set. Like,
Yeah, but it's also, these are military
sure.
flights, whether
Yeah.
they're the passenger like rotator flights that
Yeah.
are the like passenger airlines that get contracted to
Yeah.
like they don't sell commercial tickets. Like
Right.
they're like
Contracted completely for,
1980s
yeah.
aircraft, like
Yeah.
1980s companies. They don't
Right.
give, two rats about what they're
Yeah.
doing, but
Yeah.
their contract like that craft is just for DoD members like
Yeah.
PCSing or doing whatever.
Right.
Um, but the other majority of the flights are going to be like cargo aircraft.
Yeah. And
And
like,
so you've got this balance of like the operational security of keeping those
right.
flights,
Yeah.
secure out of the public versus making them available for space age folks.
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting. Like, and again, it's like this is all great. It was all a great conversation that wasn't like so much finger pointing and wasn't whatever, which, sure, arguably, I think they talked like all the questions, beforehand with the members, so there was no surprises. But the one thing that like didn't get brought up until like almost the end, and I think it was the Sergeant Major of the Army, pretty sure, was like, because there was like five or six key points that was kind of recurring through all the, sergeant majors, E9s equivalent, and it was like like troop pay, like pay for the soldiers, like housing, and single soldier barracks as well, and then like quality of life was kind of an overarching across like two or three of them. One of them was like spouse employment for DoD service members, their spouses and like whether that was like reciprocity for like state licensures and trying to get that shored up. Yo, what I didn't know, man, which was crazy, was like, because I'm not in the Navy, I didn't know that sailors, single sailors that are on ship don't have a barracks room to them. So like, and here's what I mean. So they do in theory, but like depending on what port and base you go back to after you're at sea, they could be like, yo, we've got 800 sailors on this ship. We only have 600 barracks rooms at this base that are livable. So dudes are literally living on the ship at
Yep.
home in America. And
Yeah.
then when they want to leave and go out on town or go to Berkeley, they leave the ship and then go to the place and then come back to the ship. To their like, yeah, spoiler, those things are also like Titanic World War II bunks of like, you know, 6 cube feet of foot space, like head space. I was like, what? They're like, yeah, we're trying to fight for sailors' rights and like get them all barracks rooms to live in when they're not at sea. I was like, so
Yeah.
sailors don't live in barracks when they're not. So they're like, yeah. And they just won some, you know, they haggled with like the San Diego rep was there and she talked how they just made some impact to like sailors that are at sea for maintenance missions will be given like essentially a BAH. So when they're at home, they do have a place to live. But again, that's not like the majority. Those guys are just sound like they're kind of the most, you know, frequently used types of sailors or whatever, which makes sense. I was like, bro, what? Sailors don't have barracks rooms? And it's not that they don't, it's that they don't have enough so that some live on the boat. I was like, bro, what a raw
Yeah.
deal. Like,
Yeah.
I knew there was a nuance to being in the Navy and like being at sea for like 9 months or whatever to shot and coming home or something like that. But like, that is wild, bro. Like,
Yeah. Well, it's also one of those things where, because I've heard from Navy friends who they'll talk about putting their stuff in storage when they go
yeah,
to sea,
yeah,
or having other situations like that where uh, like they don't have a quote unquote place to go back to.
mm-hmm,
Um, and it's just it is weird. You would
yeah,
think that in this day and age, like
right.
how have we gotten here?
Yeah, like
Because
it
the
would make
kicker,
sense. Right, go ahead.
well, the kicker is that they have a surplus of housing at army bases, which is why they had private citizens start living
Yeah,
in base
right.
housing, right?
Yeah,
So for those
yeah,
neighborhoods that were both on and off installations,
yeah,
the ones that are off make more sense, but the ones that are
yeah,
on are like the fuck's going on here? So
right.
they when the installation's housing falls below a certain threshold,
Yeah,
then they're authorized to lease to private citizens.
yeah,
And so that's a whole other thing. So anyways, there are some installations that have a surplus and some installations that have a deficit.
yeah,
And it's like, and this goes to show just how big the DoD is and how how many problems there are like this logistically.
yeah,
Um, it's like, how do you balance that load? And
yeah,
it's challenging.
yeah.
So
And so that was one of them. They also talked about and like one of the pieces that was like, hey, it's not all bad news. They used the representative from El Paso, Texas, was there because Fort Bliss is in El Paso, and like they kept talking about how it's kind of a good news story case study for like community there is hot, like since the community is high there, like community involvement with the bases there. And if anybody's ever been to Fort Bliss, that's because like there is nearly no delineating factor between like what is Fort Bliss and what is El Paso. Because Fort Bliss is such a peculiar base for an army base where like there's a main highway that cuts through the base. And so like you can stumble upon Fort Bliss basically. Like you could like exit the highway and be like, oh, doop doop, not through a checkpoint, and you're like in some offshoot part of the installation. That it's like it's kind of normal around all bases where there's like usually a back gate that's, you know, maybe locked, maybe not intended to because it's like quote unquote national training area or something. And so like you might be on a training area that you just didn't know, but Fort Bliss is odd. So like it sort of makes sense if you've been to Fort Bliss that it would have kind of a high community because it's kind of there's this, you know, yin yang sign mashed sort of community, physically, you know, geographically. But one of the parts they brought up too was the so the BAH thing to me was crazy with sailors, reciprocity with, oh, and I think like I said, I think it was the Army Sergeant Major that brought up like towards the end was like, hey, yeah, a bunch of these things that we're talking about, like pay, you know, predictability, whatever, quality of life. He's like, we're trying to start to look at like not moving soldiers as much. I was like, thank God, fuck, thank God, brother. Like, because that's not a topic talked about by anybody, bro, other than the junior people to like, because the seniors are all too institutionalized, in their defense, like they're too indoctrinated. Like, oh, you have to move because if you didn't move, then you didn't move, like, and your time's up. I'm like, but why is it?
So
It's not triggered by anything.
What do they say about that?
So yeah, he was like, yeah, so we're looking into that, and like, why do we have to move the soldier? Can we do like an interpost PCS? Like, can it be a trigger for some sort of there's no more billets for them? So it was a good point, and like maybe somebody like piggybacked them, but and then it just kind of it wasn't like this grand champion point, but I was like, yo, arguably you can solve some of these other problems with that solution because like the spousal employment, because you move around too much for spouses to employ. And by the time they get a job, they have to move because it's only been, it's been 3 years. And so, and don't worry about reciprocity for state licensures because like if you're not moving as much, that person doesn't have to try and transfer states for their nurse practitioner license or whatever. So like, I hope that they take that away as a key nugget because that's also, if I had to vet, that is a purely depart or branch internal policy of just watch this paint dry guys, and the next guy come by and says, watch the paint dry, and watch the paint dry. And like, because if anything, that is the military industrial complex that might be tied to that is like the transportation cost that the, contracted movers get paid, tens of thousands of dollars per person per move every single year. And so which equals to millions of dollars across the DoD every year. So like, I would see that maybe being the only kind of, well, like if we don't move them, what are the movers moving? And you're like, well, they're not in the military. That's
the Transcom contract for that, the DoD wide, and they restructured the contract a couple times over the course of like the last 10 years, and they recently did like a big modification. I believe either all went to like one giant contract, or I want to say like to one contract but like two providers. I forget exactly the details, but there was a lot of movement on that from the transportation aspect of it. But during those conversations, during those articles, they were throwing out facts like, well, the contract itself is worth like a couple single-digit billions of dollars. I forget the period. I forget the period of performance.
Yeah.
But it's like multiple billions of dollars for the contract itself. But then most of the moving companies in those rural areas, like Leavenworth, right, like in Kansas, most of those tucked away rural bases, the moving companies that service those areas, the business they get is like 99% military.
Like, I believe it.
Ain't nobody going in and out of Leavenworth that's not related to the military. You know what I mean?
Right.
Or like pick your, like Fort Sill, like not to say that these locations are like, by any means
they're just
undesirable.
Desolate. Yeah.
They're just the middle of nowhere. And so for the people that live there, they're fantastic communities, but the fact remains is that they're not like hustling and bustling.
They're not Nashville, people coming, Oklahoma City.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that piece of it. But then from the policy perspective, in my entire time in service, at this point will have been 15 years. Every couple of years, right, the big Air Force would make those statements about like, well, we're going to start moving people less. We're going to, extend the extend the orders. When I first came in, I forget if it was different before, but the standard was like, 3 years time on station before you're eligible for an overseas move, and maybe 4 years time on station until you're eligible for a CONUS move, or maybe I'm remembering wrong. Maybe it's like 2 years for an overseas, and then it's 3 years for a CONUS, or I forget. But there are certain like where you're eligible to apply for different assignments.
Yeah.
But none of that has ever panned out, and here's the reason why. Here's the reason why. During these conversations, what nobody likes to mention is the brass tacks of the math, right? Where a place like, Leavenworth, even as an example, take the permanent party that are there, right?
Yeah.
So you have X number of, major billets, for example, to teach in a schoolhouse,
right?
For the people, an X number of lieutenant colonel, X number of colonel.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a major there, like even if you wanted to stay there, where would you go to? The whole base is a training base, right? Essentially.
Yeah, right.
So it's like as a major, you go from being a trainer in a classroom to what? Right? Even if it's like, well, Joe, there's plenty of, exec jobs and this jobs and that jobs. Okay, yeah, no, but how many? Because you've got
a dozen?
upwards, because you've got upwards of maybe 80 instructors total.
Right.
So maybe like, 60 majors or 40 majors to be instructors. And how many of those other major jobs are there? Oh, like fucking 5, 10, right?
Yeah.
Like that whole population is not going to be served by those handful of jobs. So you're still, even if you're like, okay, well, we're going to shuffle people at the same base and that's going to keep people there longer. It's like, well, yeah, but you're only benefiting those like dozens, while you're still PCSing the 10s or the 20s or the, of people out of there. And then it doesn't get much better at the larger bases. So, like at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, it's a huge Air Force Materiel Command base, and there's like every level of command within AFMC, from the 4-star general headquarters to a 3-star headquarters to a 2-star headquarters to a 1-star headquarters to colonel. So there's all manner of positions, but again, even in the Air Force, the kind of like baseline standard is like 4 years, unless you apply to get out early for some reason, which there are reasons. So even if, right, it's like, well, okay, cool. Well, you move them at the halfway point, and there's plenty of jobs to go around, so cool copy. Great. So 4 years. And then that asshole's getting up and he's going to Hill Air Force Base in Utah, or he's going to Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma. And then he's going to stay there for 2 years, 2 years, move on base, and then move to a different base after the 4 years are done. So it's like, have you really changed much by now? I understand that there's a difference between moving every 3 years and every 4 years, but even like that's not what people are talking about, right? And in the Air Force, it's already been executed to the to the maximum extent that it's possible. You know, outside of the operational community, which is even in all the services, just mentioning the Navy folks being at sea, all the operational career fields, regardless of service, will suffer from like, well, this doesn't work for us, so suck it up, Buttercup. You still have to move every 2 years, or right. And then you also have the case of like schools, professional military education. So hey, congratulations, you spent 2 years at this base where you're supposed to be here for 6 years or 4 years or 10 years or 3 years. But hey, congratulations, because you're going to leave early and you're going to go to, Maxwell Air Force Base for PME, or you're going to go to Leavenworth or Carlisle, or pick your, PME base of choice for a year or less. And then you're going to pack your shit up and go somewhere else again, because even if you come back, because the whole point of PME is to give you the skill sets to serve at the higher grade. And typically it's like kind of like a graduation of sorts. So unless you're going to go back to your old base with a better assignment, like a better job, like a promotion in the job kind of a deal, at a higher graded job, then like you're wasting your time going back. So it's a challenge, but it's not insurmountable. But the way that they talk about it, and this hearing, I'll be interested to hear the comments, because I'm not discounting the comments that were made, but I would be hard pressed. I would bet you $1 that they're not any different than what's already been said in the past, and what's been said in the past hasn't resulted in change.
Yeah, and like and like nobody really had anything to say about it, because like he used it internal to like answering another question or whatever. So it's not like they even circled back. But to me, that's what I've been saying for many years now, in a different angles too, because like arguably there's certain career fields and there's certain bases that can do that more easier, but like especially in the Army, where like we just have such a mass, right? Like we have such a mass of amount of troops, and mostly enlisted, to where you're like, yo, you can make that work for most enlisted guys, which arguably are your highest turnover, right? Because there's the most amount of them, and they come in young and do a contract or two and get out, and that's just the way it's going to be, where it's just not like that as much with the officer corps. And so it's like, yeah, dude, why wouldn't you just option guys to like, and even signing up for whatever, like, hey, what base do you want to go to? We'll find you an MOS that's short at that base, send you to AIT, send you that base for a 5-year gig, like, or for a 3-year with 2-year option, like.
And I'm not sure how it is, but of course, the enlisted typically do serve in on the officers. So the numbers I gave you for the time on station, that's all for the officers. It's not out of the ordinary to see an enlisted member like stay at the base for like 6 years, maybe 8 if they like play the cards right.
Right.
But typically the enlisted are there longer than the officers. But it all goes back to the point you're making about the MOSs. It's like, there are obviously more enlisted positions at the bases because there are more enlisted, period. And so the example I gave earlier about the officers training at Leavenworth, any one, the most common bases are going to have like thousands of enlisted.
Right.
And then out of those, you're going to have a higher chance to, like, quote unquote, promote up into a position that your rank requires or your career path requires, your career pyramid. And then even if you can't, and then it's better for the position because it can be competitive to fill those positions. So it's like, hey, you're getting the best and the brightest. You're not just getting Tommy because it's his turn. It's like, no, it's, there's a competition or whatever. So it drives performance as well. But the kicker is that the DoD as a whole has already provided a solution to this exact problem. And it's called the Guard.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so when the active duty component tries to discuss staying in places longer, at a certain point, and this is more so for the whiteboard sessions when people are trying to figure out solutions.
Yeah.
It's like the solution basically equates to, okay, well, just have more people in the Guard because then like you can stay at a base for 20 years. Your wife can have gainful employment all 20 years and progress in their career. And then you can progress, as positions become available. And so it's like a weird, now I have heard smart mentors talk about like, hey, the DoD ought to go back to a pre-World War II model where the active components was much smaller.
Skeleton
and and then the Guard and Reserve were much larger. And so there's an argument to be made about that construct. And, like, should we go back to that kind of a thing?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I would think that would be a relatively low cost, easy sell for both for especially the people joining, like especially the soldiers, like, hey man, you don't want to do Army full time? Hey, dude, it's totally fine. Let's do Reserve. Like, and let's, and especially for, I want to say kind of key billet, or not key billets, but like large numbered billets where it's like, have a bunch of dudes in Reserve in the infantry or whatever. And there's all these kind of, odd legalese where like, I think we don't have any infantry reserves. We only have infantry in the National Guard. So there's some nuance to it that I'm sure policy can change or redirect or compensate or whatever. But like, man, some of that, because it's like, dude, because the cost of living is so low so high in the country and pay is so low in the military, like offset the thing. Like, hey, dude, go do your fucking corporate bank investor job, and then on 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks out of the year, go play Army as a medic or whatever. And like people want to be like, oh, well, training proficiency. I'm like, yeah, but some of that it doesn't matter if you train a weekend out of the month or like arguably a day out of the week, which is what normal Army units do. Like you can be just proficient. It's all a matter of the quality, the quality of instructors, the quality of the training, preparedness, resourcing the training, like, and that becomes.
Also, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good.
Well, I was gonna say, and also, like, how do you train? Because I think we've talked before about using video games as a training mechanism, and I know, like, in the past you've talked about playing with like special forces dudes on like Call of Duty or Halo and stuff.
Yeah, right.
And like, you're using the same radio calls on the headsets as you would in real life, and you're using the same tactics and tactics, techniques, and procedures as you would like to clear a room in the game as you would in real life. Right. And so there's a level of like muscle memory that can be built up. If not like not your physical arms and your body, but just the
Right.
like what do you do in the situation, kind of a muscle
Yeah.
memory. And then
Yeah.
also for things like StarCraft, where
Yeah,
I
dude.
remember,
Strategy, resourcing.
well, and it was there was a group of people back at Wright Pat, and there were a bunch of engineers, but they were going through their professional military education at the time, and so they would, after a game of StarCraft, okay, guys, great, well, they'd rattle through the doctrinal
Mm.
um,
Study
uh,
whatever they were doing.
categories of like, hey, do we have enough mass? Do we have enough,
Right.
like how do we do
Yeah.
on this topic, that
Yeah.
topic? And they'd run
Right.
through it just like you would a planning, like a J5 joint
Yeah.
planning,
Yeah.
cell planning
Right.
some, campaign or whatever, as a hot wash, and then they'd go back
Yeah.
and they'd start the game again and do it again.
Yeah.
So there's a lot you can do, again, it wouldn't have to be going out to the field, although you still want
Right.
that time as well. But,
Yeah.
it's about getting creative.
Yeah.
Because that
Yeah.
banker, like,
Yeah.
how
Right.
often is that banker does have time to play Xbox or whatever
Correct.
any day of the week.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
when he gets together on the weekend or the month or whatever with his
Yeah.
buds, maybe he's already
Yeah.
been, checking in on Call of Duty or Halo for the
Right.
past 5 days, and now he's there with his guys in person. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. And like because that's one of the real kicker numbers anyway. The real kicker number isn't like what's your active strength sitting at right now, because arguably the more you have on the active duty, the harder it is to maintain all those dudes' readiness. So you kind of just know through, basic training assessment model, that like not all those units are ready to fight tonight, period. Like just like NFL teams.
Yeah.
Like if you were to poll every NFL team right now, which is like, not all those teams are ready to play tonight. You can tell them like, hey, there's a game tonight. You're like, yo, Schmidt's in the bar. Like,
Yeah.
Schmidt's on recovery from he blew out his ACL last weekend. Like, and so same. And again, I think if maybe you use some like creative solutions of like, hey, maybe in order to go reserves or guard, you got to do a 2-3 year bit on active. That way you get the routine of military life, you get indoctrinated, whatever, you get kind of a esprit de corps. And then maybe it's in like cohorts or something where like, oh, those were all the dudes from Tennessee that are going to do 3 years at this base in a similar unit or same unit. And then they go back to Tennessee to be guard or whatever, reserve. And boom, like maybe there's things like that. Or maybe it's like just to go in the reserves period, you have to do a bit on active duty 2-3 years. And then you're able to go reserves and say, hey, cool. That way you understand the baseline, what it's like to be a soldier, kind of routine, importance of fight tonight, your trained ready unit, things like that, where it's like, let's think outside the bun here, man. Because then those guys would be more likely to play Call of Duty on the weekdays, off duty with each other on, Discord channels or whatever. And then also do training on the weekends together.
Yeah,
So book club.
or I mean, something as simple as, not that it's simple, but something as simple as, like paying those infantry units to quote unquote train via Xbox Live.
Yeah.
Like, hey guys, look, like, you're all the reserves or guard or whatever.
Yep.
And so like, hey, log your hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Log your hours. And oh, by the way,
Yeah.
your squad leader is going to be on the on this Discord channel, or hey, your squad leader or your platoon leader or your company leader, like, they're there as well, and they're all checking in and they're all playing together, quote unquote, training together.
Yeah.
And because look, most of the services now, at least the Air Force and the Army, and the Space Force, they have these fucking video game
esports
fucking teams.
Yeah.
Esports teams, like they have for like national, like service level soccer teams and service level like other teams. They've got esports teams. So you're telling me that on the one hand, you're going to take somebody off the line and go put them on an esports team, but on the same hand, you're not going to let give dollars to have Smitty train actual TTPs in like Call of Duty or Halo or something.
Yeah.
So it's crazy.
And then just like sit down with the game developers and pay Blizzard like a fucking $1 million to be like, yo, make all these little nuanced things that are the realistic, and then only let these guys buy it or whatever. Or like it's this code they put into the game, and then that unlocks the active duty comp or the Army compo controlled environment or whatever to help replicate more.
And I don't think you'd even need to go that far because
right.
But like, don't even there's a whole tangent about in the Air Force captain's course at Maxwell, there's a like software game, quote unquote, that's supposed to teach like air concepts of and it's basically like a cheap knockoff of StarCraft.
Oh yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
I shit you not, with my experience on IT acquisition and this kind of a thing, I bet you $1 that what happened was somebody, some veteran created a company. His buddy used the government purchase card to like pay this company in installments that were less than the threshold, and that this company like delivered this garbage heap of a dumpster fire product to the DoD or to the Air Force, I guess, and they've just been using it ever since, and it's hot garbage, and I haven't helped them if they're still using that, but it's like this garbage, and then it's like so anyways, they could just use like StarCraft or because you know whether or not you have a little F-35 icon on the screen or not, like doesn't really matter because it's a fucking game anyways. Like there's no like DoD system where you're staring at like a StarCraft-esque screen with that same ability that you have in StarCraft, or even this like Air Force game that I paid, you know, probably through questionable means at Maxwell. Like there's no equivalent to that in the real world. So it's going to be an exercise-ism anyways, you know? So just fucking deal with it and then just run with it. Like we don't pay for a government version of Word.
Right.
If we did, we'd be overpaying and it would be decades behind the commercial version. So like that's a good reason why we don't.
Yeah. And like I tried to get one of my guys when I was in command, I tried to get a guy who was he was like being recruited for the Army esports team. But like it was kind of early on in the Army esports, and it was like this weird shoddy, like, hey, we're only going to bring in like, you know, 8 or 10 people from across the Army to be on the main team, but we'll have all these like farm team feeder teams that like, you know, you'll do on your own time, but like we'll pull the next guys, you know, the next crew of 8 or whatever from that. And so like he was kind of getting his chain yanked around by this thing, but he was a big time gamer. He was like a ranked, you know, US level gamer or whatever. I was like, hey man, how about you set up like a LAN party for the unit, like during the day on like a Tuesday, and like we'll do some training with that. And he was like, and like laughed, and I was like, you know, like I'm serious, just you know, set it up, and then like, you know, maybe we echelon it up to where like, you know, at first the whole squad's in the same room and like they're all playing the same, you know, part of the thing as first person shooters. And I was like, and then maybe as we go up, it's like, hey, cool, now the Joes are together and the squad leader is in a different room and he's using his Army radio to talk to and from the guys to like see what's going on, you know, and then as things happen, you guys send reports up to the platoon leader and the platoon leader sends them to me, and like we all do it through our tactical radios and stuff, and we track it on our maps, even if it's a map of Call of Duty or whatever. Like let's just make it fun. Like let's make it fun to train as a team on a system that you are very intimately familiar with, and it's modern, and I'll do it during work time. And he was like, thought I was kidding with him. And then I engaged him, like, you know, I was like, no, I'm serious. Like, just sketch it out. Let me know. And like, what day you want to do it and whatever, you know, we'll put it on the counter. And, I just thought he was going to like take this, run with it, you know, like do it. And, it never ended up happening. And then I engaged him like, you know, a month later and like 2 months later or whatever. And I was like, oh, he's like, I thought you were kidding, sir. I was like, yeah, no, I'm serious as a heart attack. Cause like, one, it's fun. I want to play Xbox during work, and then just justify why. And two, like it's super valuable, man. You know, he's like, yeah, no, I think it could be too. I was like, yeah, so like do it. And it was just like, but he was one of the busiest guys in the company.
Yeah.
And so, and he was like going on the promotion board, and he, you know, we had a ton of exercises we ran into, and so like he had missed his kind of few month chance where it would have been the most easiest to execute, and in preparation for our major training events. Like that's why I wanted to do it before those. That way at the major training events, it wasn't like one of the first times, you know, in forever that we'd been out and training together or whatever. But
well,
yeah. And I
like,
told my first sergeant,
this fucking captain's gonna trick me. He's gonna write me up for wasting his time or wasting my time.
And I told my first sergeant, and at first he was kind of like, you know, sir, are you like, did you sleep much last night or like what's the? And then I was like, no, hear me out, man. He's like, I was like, dude, even if we just do it to start as like an org day type of thing, like, he's like, you know, whatever, I'll get behind it. Like, and he was like, yeah, it seems valuable. Like, and then it, like I said, died off, and then that guy became like an important person in the company for other reasons. So he was just task saturated, and I was like, oh, that's not gonna happen. And so it ended up not happening. But I was like, yeah, but like little things like that where creative solutions. And so like, like I said, the testimony was interesting. They talked a lot about recruiting, and then they talked about retention a little bit, and which was sort of surprising, where they're like, kind of all the branches were like, yeah, we don't have a retention problem, and they're like, our numbers are good. And I was like, yeah, but like, that, so retention is such a peculiar measurement, right? Because like, oftentimes guys will retain and reenlist because they want to leave their unit. So like, they don't usually, and I don't have any numbers to back this up, so don't quote me and don't FOIA me, but like, they usually reenlist to catch different options. Because like, they have plenty of the numbers. Like most guys didn't do more than, I don't know, 2 contracts, like, 4 or 6 years. And in the Marines, they have the numbers, and like the dudes don't do more than like 1 contract or whatever. And so like the average Marine is like 22 years old, like that, like they're across the entire Corps or whatever. And so, but that's where I was like, yeah. And they acknowledged that, which was kind of relieving too, where they're like, yeah, like arguably some of these guys still have the same woes, but like that they care about still serving more than they have frustration with the, big 5, 6 points we're talking about that are hurting the military. And so, and that's always been interesting to me, because I've witnessed guys being like, are you going to reenlist? He's like, only if I can get Italy or Germany, it's like, okay, so if you can't guarantee going to Italy or Germany, you're not going to stay in. He's like, yeah, no, like I don't want to be here. Like,
yeah. Well, and I think that's where there's got to be a disconnect in how the service is tracking or like how at a service level, how they're tracking retention and how the individual perceives retention. Because like it also applies to individual career fields, where like the career field, like the acquisition career field in the Air Force, like if you talk to any Joe in that field, they're like, yeah, no, I look to my left, look to my right, both those dudes got out, and the guys to their left and to their right also got out. Like I'm the asshole sitting here in the middle, like still here in the service or whatever. But then you talk to the career field manager, and they're like, "Oh yeah, no, like we're good.
Shipshape.
We're good. We're shipshape. Yeah. Like what are you talking about? We don't have a retention problem."
Then it makes you wonder, what is the tolerable level of retention? Because you could be at 100% retention if your goal is 60% retention.
Yeah.
Because that's really the measurement that you need to know. Because they all told the chairs and whatever, that they're like, yeah, we're all 90% and above on our retention efforts for this year or whatever. And so we're like, cool.
Right.
What is your threshold for retention? Is it 60% of your troops stay in? Is it 70? Is it 2? Is it 100? Because like, that's really the like, no, I didn't fail the course. You're like, well, what's a failing? You're like, oh, well, below a D is failing. And you're like, all right, well, that's not good over time. You won't pass high school with all C's. Like,
D plus in college. Like success. That was
yeah. Or a better way to say it is like, what's your definition of an F? And they're like, oh, an F is a 40% or below. You're like, bro, an F is anything other than a C or higher. So like, D is a cute way to say you're failing. Like,
yeah. But exactly. But you're making my point, where it's like we don't know how the services are defining success. We don't know what that looks like on their end, and because there is a clear disconnect between the service members' reality and what the services are saying is fine. But I'd be curious, because I also heard I discovered recently that the Marine Corps has a retention board, like a standing, like they have a promotion board.
Okay. Sorry, if I got to bounce, I'll call you back in like 5.
Okay, all right, man. All right, love you. Bye.
Love you. Yeah. So all in all, like, it was a pretty interesting hearing. And like I said, it was it's some good news stories shared, which was neat, and like it's kind of centered around recruiting and like, hey, like what are you doing for recruiting? Or like, hey, what are you doing since last year? And the Army was like, like our numbers are up from 22 to 23, but we don't have all 23's numbers in yet. And so we can't give you a certain for sure, but like, even the first few quarters or whatever were good, or like even 24 is looking better. Cause it was like, there was a huge deficit in 22, and then, so they had like a 10% increase in 23, but that's still against the delta of whatever the 22 deficit really was. So they didn't have they didn't rattle like specific numbers per se, but it was interesting. It was also always fun to just see some sort of nuance. Like they would ask something that would be like, clearly pointing to the Army or Marine Corps. They'd be like, well, if anybody else has anything too, and like like Bass would jump in, or like the Space Force dude's name is like hard to pronounce, so everybody would butcher it. And then like I said, the what was it, like Marcus Luttrell or whatever, the Luttrell brothers in office was like, I usually start us open with a joke, and like, I'm just razzle dazzle with this Space Force uniform. You're a sharp looking dude. And like he's like he goes down this like 3-minute roll down of like all the uniforms. He was like, hands down, still best. Marine Corps. I gotta give some. Marine Corps does it to do it right. Army. You had to go back to World War II. So that plays out for you. And we'll find it. It looked good though. And then he's like, Air Force, he goes, you keep doing what you're doing. You're good. Like, it was like, he's like, Navy, feel your pain, brother. He was like, Air Force, you're good, man. You're doing fine, Vass. Like, yeah. And, he's like, I'm from a great state of Texas, the United Kingdom, Republic of Texas. And, my background's in psychology. And then he went on, like, he's like, kind of random but related, because he was like, we don't take care of our veterans too well, but like we need to start doing baseline assessments for all service members coming into the military. I was like, actually, it's a really good point, because like if you don't get your monthly CT scan, I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
But he was like, we need to do a better job at doing like baseline assessments, because like these dudes catch injuries that you don't document at all, and if they're lucky, you document them on the outro. And then you try and haggle with them to pay for it on the after exit, with the VA kind of stuff. And so he's like, I know it's a whole different, department, but it still needs to start with your entry into the service. And I know we didn't know as much as we knew before as we do now, but now we know. Like,
but here's the kicker though, because when I was in recruiting, all the MEPs, the military entrance processing stations, where you go to get your medical to be qualified for the military service. All those MEPs, right? They have like a combination of, sometimes military doctors, but usually government paid civilian doctors. And so in one case, I think it was a story that one of the senior enlisted were telling me that, like, at some MEPs in his AOR at some point in his career, this doctor had worked at the VA as a doctor in the VA system. And so he used his experience from the VA. And when he was looking at these 18-year-olds, 17, 18-year-olds, he'd be like, oh, well, this is going to be a problem when you get out. So like, no, disqualified. So he was pre-screening based on his experience at the VA, because he was looking at it from a taxpayer of like, this guy, he's only going to be able to serve for like 6 months because his knees are going to give out. Or like, no, this dude's going to have like lifelong back issues because he's going to be rucking, with 80-pound ruck on his back, and that's going to tear up this like, thin meniscus or whatever, he saw in this kid's body. So he was disqualifying folks based on that, and the recruiters like revolted against him, and this like the military, because those MEPs, they service all the services, right? They provide they provide that same function to all the services. So he wasn't just like screwing over one or the other components, like Air Force, branch. He was basically limiting the number of recruits that the recruiters could put up to satisfy their quotas. And so it was a huge deal. So eventually the guy, there's a whole bunch of things that got involved, but eventually the guy was removed or left, like whatever. The guy vacated the position, and then everything went back to the status quo. Now, the challenge is that the VA is a separate department, and so within the government. So the veterans, the Department of Veterans Affairs, just like you have the Department of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that's the kicker, right? Where it's a mismatch, and that's why our medical records get screwed up so poorly when we transition out of the DoD and transition into the Department of the Veterans Affairs. So if those were just one fucking department, then like now, even if they became one department like overnight, like by congressional action, you'd have the same situation as you do in the Department of Homeland Security, where they took like 11 different agencies and lumped them all together. And even to this day, they still have like interoperability issues. So, I mean, just like waving a magic wand, there's no such thing as waving a magic wand in this situation because those records are still like in disparate systems. But from a recruiting perspective, if there was more care and attention paid to the life cycle of that individual, as in like soup to nuts, cradle to grave, where this guy is, entering into the service with his exit interview in mind. So he should be getting an intro, an introductory, some kind of a introduction, initial, battery of all sorts of tests, not just, physical, but also like mental. And it's something that I sent you a video because I thought it was a scam, but this whole thing about like traumatic brain injury related to concussions from artillery and fucking like RPGs and stuff. I thought I thought for sure you're going to come back and say, oh yeah, that was a bunch of bullshit. But the first thing you said was like, yeah, no, that's actually a big thing, huge thing. And I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, man. And like, it's like odd because sure, because like you do the calculations and you study the physics of like all this, overpressure is usually the term used for like demolitions, where like overpressure is all this displacement of energy from this demolition charge, and the overpressure, right, is all the like non-visible fucking energy that's it's like breaking the sound barrier, where like you see that and you hear it, and like that's the same with demolition. And so like you stand close to those things at a quote unquote safe distance. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And then also sometimes it's the frequency of it, like repetitiveness, where guys, for example, like the Carl Gustav, which is a anti-tank rocket launcher, like you gotta like round count those guys at an exercise, because you're like, yo, how many have you shot today? And they're like, oh, I don't know. You're like, that's not good. Like well, you need to find out how many Schmitty shot, because like Schmitty is puking blood today. Like, so you're like, or like Schmitty doesn't know how to tie his shoes anymore. And so you're like, get him some water and dirt, and like, and it's simple things like that just compound and add up. And they know now that like CTE is a real thing, and they find it in pro sports athletes, non-contact sports too, like basketball and like especially football kind of thing, where like it's essentially a concussion, but like it's a long-term lasting. And I couldn't tell you the definition of it or even the medical whatever is it, but like they find that with guys with demolition, and especially operators, because they arguably breach more frequently and more closer than like regular guys in the line. And so like that's why a bunch of these dudes that like Rogan's buddies with, like the Andy Stumps of the world, are like, yeah, no, my brain's rattled from these blasts, bro. Like, and blast after blast, night after night for 6 months in country. So even though you're there for a shorter duration, the intensity was higher or the frequency was higher of ops compared to the guys in the line, where then they have like lesions on their brain. They have displacement of hormones because of your body's natural reaction to stress and anxiety. And so like, yeah, it's a real thing that is, I don't want to say wildly undertreated or documented, but pretty underdocumented. Like I don't have any documentation for my demolitions on my medical record. And like I've been to a lot of demolition ranges. And again, being an officer, it's a different lifestyle too. So they kind of just hand wave that. And they're like, what's your MOS? I'm like, 12 Alpha. They're like, okay, so you're not really like, I'm like, well, but like, I'm really with the Joes. Like, and I'm safety overseeing every fucking dangerous transaction and action they take. So, man, I'm right next to the plunger puller here. And so like, and I have to run every iteration, which is different NCOs I'm running through these qualifications, but I'm the OIC standing there over top of them as a safety and validator, to where one squad will run through this lane once a day or twice a day, but I have to run through all 5 squads 2 times a day. So like I'm sitting there taking 10 blasts when each squad leader is only taking 2 blasts a day. Now, sure, he stays in longer than me and he's on the line longer than me, but like those numbers aren't as far off as you'd think between the company grade, where you spent 10 of your years, certifying and qualifying these guys, where that enlisted guy might have done it more times, but he stayed in less time. So they some of those come out in the wash, especially in the early years. And in the late years, they get exponentially sort of different too, but on both sides. So, but yeah, it's a very real thing that.
And that'd be interesting. But those contacts with like high explosives are documented in like a range card of some sort, I'd imagine.
Bro, no, man, that's the thing, dude. That's what I'm telling you. It's very fucking real problem.
So let me ask this then. Let me ask it a different way. So copy that. That's not documented in your medical history. But is there like any piece of paper in the Army that you're aware of, or in the military in general that you're aware of, that would document, like, maybe not all of the explosive, encounters that you've had, but the ones that you could document? So like if you're like an operator out in the firefight or whatever, you may not be able to document that kind of stuff. But if you were at a training range, specifically if you were at a training range, like you're telling me is there a piece of paper that documents that kind of exposure?
The short answer is no. Yeah, the short answer
but
is
even,
no. And I'm not even kidding, dude.
Let me ask you. So like even to the,
because it's not in my training record. It's not in my training record on my digital training management system.
Well,
record.
so
because it's not a weapon system, I'm qualified on too.
Okay, but I remember you telling me the ASPAN it can be to like get time on a live range or on a range in general. And so for example, right, like any piece of, so like your company or your battalion, like they would have had to have checked out a certain number of ordnance, right? And then was it documented, like who was at the range those days that would be that would have that ordnance? So it may not be like a single encapsulated piece of paper that says Schmitty fired 10 155 rounds this Tuesday, but is it like, hey, this company checked out this many 155s, and then these people were there to qualify that day for this weapon system, and that these people were qualified. And if they were qualified, that means that they had to use the test, and the test uses like 5 rounds. So for every test you conducted, you had to fire 5 rounds. So that guy who qualified, he had at least 5 rounds, and then the testers had at least 5 rounds per individual. They had 10 individuals that day. Just what I'm saying. Can you build that story based on the logistics?
You could maybe, and why I even say maybe is like, so in theory, sure. Yeah, in theory, yes. Why it becomes, and I can only talk for engineers, even though I've played ball with a lot of these other, like field artillery and other guys, but like specifically with engineers, why it's very difficult to track that is since demolition is not a weapon system, and by that I mean like it's not on our digital training record that we qualified on demolition. Like, so period, end of statement. Period of end of statement is not on our training record that we qualified on demolition. Also not on our medical record. So the only way you could try, like what you're saying, is like Alpha Company, this unit drew out 100 pounds of C4. Here's the roster of everyone that attended that range, and they blasted about 5 blasts apiece. Here you go, doc. And or you could try and put that in the training system under like an odd job made up category. And so that's why specifically demolition is so, it's not that it's unregulated, but it is not documented. And to include senior, mentors and friends of mine that get out and then they're on their way out and they're like, oh, you have like a lesion on your brain. And they're like, what are you talking about? They're like, yeah, I mean, this could be from like you got in an RPG blast. Is that what happened? They're like, yeah, downrange a couple times. And they're like, did you get treated for it? They're like, no, I drank Gatorade and fucking sat in air conditioning the next day for a couple hours. Like, so those are like the extreme that you would think, sure, they might have an easier case. So they can prove they were deployed in Iraq. They can prove that they got a Purple Heart. They might maybe easier case to prove. But like the garrison guys, which, again, it's been all my time, is like we pull out 100 blocks of C4 from an ammo point. 2 guys picked that up. So they could say like, oh, these 2 guys picked it up, sure, on behalf of the company or whatever. But then you roll through 100 dudes from that company with a few blasts apiece, and you don't have that written down anywhere, and barely on local record. And by local record, I mean not in a system record. And so on a good day, you would say, hey, this battalion, 600 people, has implemented this demolition safety certification program, which is all kind of the battalion level and lower. So, these 12 captains, these 2 majors, these like 30 lieutenants, and these, 30 NCOs are all demo qualified according to this battalion standard. And here's the safety standard and whatever. You could start there and then work your way down to like take all the combat ammo, take each range, and you could do 10 of those ranges in a year. You could do 2 of those ranges in a year, right? So that's how kind of wildly it can vary. And some of the other systems become easier to track. So like a field artillery crew, they do certify on a weapon system, like on a cannon crew, that I believe goes into their digital training management system and saying like, hey, these guys, maybe by name, went and fired these tables in these certification tables for these big guns, you know. To shoot that table, you shoot 100 rounds, and they did that table 2 times this year, so they each have 200 rounds worth of blast damage to their head and fucking internal organs. That would be an easier way. That would be a way and a easier field to track. But the engineers, man, like and fuck, dude, you could, and the blasts that you're blowing too can vary so wildly as like, you could be blowing up a block of C4, which is like a couple pounds of demolition, or you could be blowing up like 50 pounds of demolition a couple times a day on a range. And so, and the distance that you stood to, because that's like, they also just assume, you know, yeah.
But,
so it's short answer is no, like super no.
So I understand that, you know, if you pull 100 pounds of C4, you know, each individual could explode, could detonate like a half pound, or like 2 people could detonate the whole 100 pounds. But the draw sheet or whatever, like the documentation from the armory to the unit would still have at least that it was documented. They drew, you know, 100 pounds of C4, and then it would be dependent on the whatever local records they would have of what happened to that is what it is. So, I'm just trying to figure out, like I said, if there was a way to backtrace that in official documentation, that everyone would have to do. So like the armory draw would have to be done by anybody, because that's where you keep the explosives or whatever.
Right.
But the reason this is important, I think, is because in the Air Force, like I think this is the same for every service, because inevitably it's like you look to your left, look to your right, all of your peers in your year group, or whatever year group that is, and whatever career field that is, like they all start dropping like flies from leukemia, or from like brain cancer, or from liver, like whatever cancer. And then it's like, oh, hey,
they can't have boys because they can only have girls because they stood too close to the radar dish.
I mean, that's another thing. That's a different thing. But it's like, hey, it is a real thing. But this whole like the cancer thing, right? Where it's like, oh, hey, wait a minute. Yeah. Schmitty, you're telling me you got cancer too? Like, I just got diagnosed last week, and then Tommy just died 2 weeks ago. Like, holy shit, wait a minute. We were all at this base together, or whatever, right? We've all been in this career field for 20 years. And so they found that with the nuclear people that had to deal with like nuclear cleanup at all those nuclear test sites in the Pacific. They found that with the Agent Orange people. They found that with, most recently, the missileers who were at certain missile bases. They've recently have launched investigations into, like, hey, you know, if you've been at these bases in these years, like, you need to raise your hand, because there's a whole like Air Force wide study that's being executed, and they may have wrapped up, or they may have just started. I forget which one, but so I see that just like in the NFL, where the whole traumatic brain injury was a like low lying kind of a anecdote, and it gained steam as more and more people, you know, realize that it was more widespread.
Right.
I think this whole like fucking concussion thing is going to be that way. Yeah. So that's why it's like, hey, like document what you can right now. But in the past, like whatever's happened in the past, like grab as much documentation as you can, and then like whatever you do in the future, like try to document it as much as you can. And then maybe even to the point where it's like, hey, after a day of the range, like go check into the piece with your PCM. To be like, hey, you know, I just had a day of the range. Like, I just want to document that, you know, I have a headache, or that I have like, you know, blurry vision, or that I'm like, whatever, just to get in a record of some sort. Because I bet you $1, man, like this is going to be the next big thing. You know, like,
and like it's already happening with different ailments or whatever, with like some of these like Hunter 7 Foundation's a group, a nonprofit that works for it and lobbies on behalf of like, I think their thing, and if I'm sorry if I'm confusing with someone else, is like the burn pits downrange in Iraq and Afghanistan. And like, bro, when people
another example,
don't have any,
Dude,
like when people don't have any conception of like how much stuff we burned in proximity to also where people literally sleep and eat. And I'm not even on the poupons yet, and I'll get there, but like burning, bro, they burn literally almost everything. It's like you burn cardboard trash, you burn trash, you burn cans, you burn batteries, like you didn't have a dumpster because you didn't want the Al Qaeda to get it, so like you burned it, and dudes had to sit there and stir the burn pit, and then also all that burn is going somewhere, and you're not doing that 100 miles away from base, like you're doing that directly next to base on the fob because that's secure, and so like guys, have lung cancer or whatever, and things of that sort because they were sleeping in proximity because that's where the sleep tents are. And so it's like, and the poupons, bro, you can Google the poupons in Afghanistan on I think it's in Jalalabad, but it's a major base, and the name's eluded me. It's a major fob, and like it was like the size of a city or whatever. The poupons are like smack dab in the middle of this thing, and there are literal human waste lagoons that like were designed back in the early days, and then expansion just happened around them to facilitate putting more poo in there, because you don't want to go lateral and lengthwise. You want to go, circular because it's easier logistically to get all the poo in there. And like these poupons sit in the open Afghan desert, and they feed from like one pond to another to like dry out and whatever. But you are sleeping. It's like sleeping next to an open porta potty, like a non-roof, non-walled porta potty, a lake of human waste, and like dude slept all around that, and you cooked around that, and you consumed food around that, like, and I mean that's definitely not healthy. And so even things like that are like these, maybe silent killers isn't quite the right term, but like silent ailments for sure that are definitely service related, is all I'm saying. Like there's no way it's not. So yeah, things like that where you're like, oh, were you in this base between this year group? You're like, bro, I spent 3 years there, like on and off for 6 years. So yeah, I slept there. Like, okay, yeah, let's write that down, And so it's like, those are, and again, some of those are catching more traction. And like even John Stewart, I think, helped with one of these get pushed across part of the finish line because he was like, yeah, this isn't okay. Like we got to take care of our vets. Like you had them burning human waste and batteries. It's definitely not good for you. Like,
Yeah.
and so yeah, some of those things are crazy, man. Like I said, and some of the weapon systems are easier to track for the range purposes. Where like, Karl Gusov, like you're like, oh, we drew 30 rounds, each guy shot 2 in one day. And you're like, okay, you could maybe go document it a little bit easier that way. And that could go into also your training record since it's a weapon system. But again, and one of the real crux of the problems is like the live fire exercises, because typically the live fire exercises don't go into your training record, system of record, because like it's a unit level event that looks different for everyone. But like if an infantry company goes out to do a company level live fire, like that is 100+ dudes because they got a squad of sappers with them, and they got field artillery supporting them, and they got maybe a couple of their enablers supporting them, and they go and move from one point to another. They set up a patrol base. They move from that base. They start putting in direct fire on target. They're calling an aircraft. They get to the target. They breach the target with explosives. They're now shooting live rounds onto close targets. They're doing grenades into grenade pits. They're doing shotguns into closed doors, and they're shooting through shoot houses, and machine guns going off during a lot of that, and mortars. And so it's not, it is trackable, but it's not like that. Then it's documented on their company training calendar in their system of like, yep, we executed that. It goes on their local calendar that they executed it in a local assessment that most of those dudes were there or whatever. But those are, that's thousands of rounds. That's like a couple 100 pounds of explosives. That's a couple 100 pounds of ordnance. Like, and proximity is also a factor with like hearing and the hearing but the hearing mitigation they have now is like, oh, well, now hearing is no longer a VA disability claim. They'll just give you hearing aids. And you're like, cool. I'm talking about overpressure and concussion on my dome piece. Like, I got it. You can help me here with the robot ears. Roger that. Like, I'm talking about my brain. Like, I'm talking about my internal organs, that are getting concussed from this fucking 40 millimeter, 60 millimeter mortar that's going off right next to me. So yeah, it's once you sent me that, I was like, no wonder they pulled the plug on this program. Cause like, it's nearly untrackable, and that's a whole fucking dumpster of skeletons that you don't want to, open.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's probably as obvious as the burn pits are now, where it's like I can't, because I never deployed to the Middle East, to any of those bases, but like I
Fingers
cannot
crossed.
imagine.
Not yet.
Well, yeah, exactly, dude, right?
Yeah.
But I cannot imagine any service member arriving and then like seeing the burn pits or seeing the poupons and being like, oh yeah, this is normal. Like, oh yeah, this is healthy, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like I'm sure every single one of them that deployed and went through those bases was like, yeah, hey, no, like this isn't permanent, right? Like this is like we're gonna stop doing this like next week, like like when we get so because it's that obvious, right?
Right.
And they even had, I mean, there was a struggle to get people benefits for the burn pits and for that kind of stuff, right? Where, so it's just this, we look at the brain injury today and it's obvious, when you look at it that something's wrong there. And so I think it'll be obvious, hopefully they get some traction and people start having to document it. Cause like even in Korea, like for a period of time, when the air quality was more poor, it's still bad today, but like it's not as bad as it was, I guess, before COVID. If you were stationed in South Korea during a certain period of time, it's documented in your like medical records or something. So when you get out,
did you suck on yellow dust while you were? You're like, I don't know what that is. They're like, were you here these years? You're like, I lived there for 2 years. Yeah. They're like, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if they can do that kind of stuff for the air quality piece, like I just don't understand why they can't do it for the other. Because again, the challenge is like all that money is coming out of the federal government. So independent of what department we're talking about, whether it's the Veterans Affairs or DOD, it may not be competing for dollars inside or those departments themselves because it's not the DOD's bill to pay, it's the VA's bill to pay. At the end of the day, it's still the federal government's bill to pay. So absolutely, it is coming out of the same pot of money. Now the DOD's budget, and I think there were like either videos or essays written about this where it's like, for every conflict, you have a tail, after that conflict ends, or like, a 40-year tail where you're paying for those veterans benefits through the VA, through a variety of mechanisms. So until all those veterans, pass, hopefully of old age, you're still paying the bill on their benefits. And so it doesn't matter like how many trillions we've spent in the 20 years of GWAT, we'll be paying for those 20 years, many times over the next 50 years as all those veterans, again, pass, hopefully naturally. So, it's really,
man.
Man.
And like what's also not talked about, which is on one of the Sergeant Major's points where he was like, or it was Marcus Luttrell where he's like, we need to do baseline assessments when they come in, because like even that, like I've never had a single scan of my brain since being in, because they've quote unquote been no reason to. So like even that, when they go to get out, you only have the extra survey to base off of because you never did an intro or intermediate survey of a brain, and so. You're like, you could come out with a scrambled brain. They're like, well, was your brain scrambled when you got in? You're like, I don't even remember when I came in. Which is, a problem. And then too, like the soft injuries. So things like, or like soft ailments where like, dude, I definitely have like what I coined with a friend was like Army onset adult ADHD. And like that is stuff like, oh hey, where's my email? Gotta check my email. I go through my email, see all the red inboxes and what's this? Oh, my Teams thing. Oh, my team. Oh hey, go check my other portal for the thing. And then like, what's the boss want? Okay, cool slide. Do a one slider. All right, one slider. What's that? Oh, he needs another thing. And so like you're like constantly running high idle like all day, which sure I get, but like when your body thinks all that is like urgent, like your brain, because you're like, oh, career driven, blah blah. But then like you take a step back and you get home and you're exhausted because I fucking literally can't even think about what I want to eat for dinner. And like, it's not just because I had a long day, but it's because I had a high fucking intensity day mentally. And not all of it was urgent, but it's all treated like it's urgent. So like even things like that where like adult ADHD, adult anxiety, like adult, I don't know, adult, but like depression, things like that that are way less documented because people don't even know that they have ADHD and that they got it from work, like regular work. And that's like also a problem because like some of that is solvable, like some of it's not, some of it's treatable, some of it's not. And like, bro, even degenerative discs, like I was going on PT the other day and he's like, yeah, well, you definitely probably have, he goes, I could scan your neck, but what's probably going to find is you probably have degenerative discs in your neck. And I was like, okay. He's like, on my record? He's like, well, we haven't scanned it. And I was like, should we? Like, and so it's like, because it's this haggle 1 foot, just this jockey back and forth of like, if we scan that, is it going on my record? If it goes on my record, am I more likely to not be given certain positions because I have this flag on my record? Right? It's like answering the wrong answer on the PHA where you're like,
right.
Yes or no I was supposed to say. Like, because that one, now I have a follow-on question. I thought follow-on questions are bad. You're like, did I fucking fail this? Like, and then you do that once out of 10 times you do it, and then you're like, someone's like, hey, if you just come in, we just want to talk to you for a minute. You're like, fuck, it was the wrong box. Like,
right.
Which I did once, and they were like, what was this about? I was like, I don't know, I was just feeling lonely. Like, and they're like, okay, like anything else? Like, no, ship shape, bro. Ship be shape. But like, And so, because I was like filling the survey out at a time where I was like, yeah, no, I have felt like hurting myself or a coworker in the last 30 days. I fucking clicked that, and they're like, hey, we just gotta do a follow up. I was like, what's that? I was like, I know, I was just frustrated at work the other day, like, and so it like some of those too, on like the mental health, which like, the more I find out through just personal experience with things and professional, like the mental health spectrum is like a pretty big spectrum, and like the colors are wildly vivid or different in the different parts of the spectrum. And it's where I'm like, I'm a 32-year-old man, and I'm finding out within the last couple of years that like, the difference between a psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, behavioral health specialist, a cognitive health specialist, like this big spectrum of like, what are to some of the older generation are like fake things or whatever, but they're real. And each professional can give you certain services and can't give you others. They got capabilities and limitations like everybody else. And so it's like if you ask a plumber to fix your electrical, like he can fuck with it, but like he can't, maybe not up the code, like unless he was trained by an electrician or whatever. And so it's like those same things with your brain tool system. That's like, okay, hey, well, all right, what you're having a problem with is like, it's not so much anger management as you are anxious. So when you get anxious and about a topic that's stressful, then you get frustrated and then you yell and like, but you don't necessarily have an anger problem. You have an anxiety problem. Like, you get angry. So it's like, okay. And then it's like, oh, well, you're not depressed. Like you are feeling lonely because you're feeling disconnected from the team. So like, it's not that you are depressed, but it's that you're excluded from the group or whatever. So it's like, and then you have anxiety coupled with that. So anxiety is just like this, constant white noise of fucking stress through everything, and it amplifies other things. So those are like some of the ones that are a little more, or those are some of the ones too that are less captured. And, we're still fighting the stigma off of like behavioral health stigma. That's like, oh, hey, no, go get help. It's fine. But what they're not telling you at times is like, well, that won't ruin your career. But it will limit it for good and bad reasons, like, because they do want a guy that has a relatively clean bill of health, who's like the football guy or whatever, like the guy holding the launch codes, or like the guy who's pulling the trigger, and you're like, sure, okay, or the guy who's like counting numbers. I don't know, but
well, and they do like, because I have seen and heard like both anecdotally as well as like in person, senior leaders, mostly senior leaders, like the E8s, E9s of the world, where they'll they'll say things like, hey man, I go to the behavioral health like every week or every month or whatever,
right.
And I go in uniform because I want the Joes to see that I'm there. I want the Joes to see that like, this E8 or E9 is going to mental health or going to behavioral health or going to whatever, brain health, because they want to normalize that. And then the behavioral and mental health people will talk about like, hey man, like you have physical training every day to keep your body in shape. Like you wouldn't expect to run a marathon without like getting, staying in shape. And so, you clean out your house, like every spring or whatever, you got to keep your brain, your mental state in the same kind of shippy shape and you're not gonna be able to do that without, exercising your brain muscle or like, talking to somebody about your gray matter or whatever. So there has been a lot of like, but that comes and goes, right? Where, for everything you see like that, you also see a story of like, oh, hey man, like, where's Tommy? Oh, Tommy talked to behavioral health and we ain't seen him since. Like, and now in those cases, like there is, because the Air Force a couple of years ago did a couple of like high profile down days where it's like, hey man, like the Air Force is standing down, we're taking a knee to, Tuesday for like mental health day or whatever. And like you said, there are legitimate reasons why you'd want somebody to be seen. And even like at the local level, I remember a time in the squadron where the O5 command, like one of the enlisted guys was having some marital problems, and it was like threatening to, like, he and his wife were at the point where they were going to get a divorce, and like he was telling our first sergeant, like, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna kick him out of the house. I'm gonna kick her out of the house. I'm gonna stop paying her cell phone bill. I'm gonna stop paying her this and that and the other. And the first sergeant was like, no, like, do not do that. Like, do not do that. You can't, like, and then like had to coach this guy through like, hey man, like you have to stay reasonable. You have to do like don't do anything drastic like that. Don't do this and that and the other.
Yeah.
Like you gotta stay civil. You gotta stay. Certainly you have to stay civil at a minimum, but like don't take these kinds of drastic measures. And because people, they make those decisions in an emotional state, and so unless you have those people there to bounce, to talk to you and bounce those things off of, even if you think you're venting and you think you've already made up your mind, those kinds of people can, like the first sergeants or the commander, can help give you your perspective back and like help you keep a level head. Because like you said, like not everyone's going through depression, but most people will go through like loneliness or whatever, or the typical emotions of life, and it's not to say that we should all be robots, but to your point, about normalizing mental health and all that kind of stuff. The Army, I know, does like PT every morning, no matter where you are, unless you are.
Right.
So like a first step, right, could be like, hey, look, every Friday is mental health day. We're all going to the doc, we're all going to medical, and we're going to spend, 20 minutes a piece, or have it, be rotating, right, where it's like, hey, this company is going to mental health on Tuesday, and this company is going to mental health on Thursday. Or like break it up so that you're not all there at the same time. For the logistics of getting people through, but that would, because again, as much emphasis as the Army and the military in general puts on, physical health, cool copy. They put their resources, aka their time, to where their mouth is, right?
Right.
So if the DoD really is serious about mental health, then they ought to, like, again, make some kind of, quasi-mandatory, just like how PT is like quasi-mandatory, efforts to get that squared away. So But hey, man, I gotta go ahead.
Yeah.
One last point.
You're good. Even like a proactive approach or like that. Like oftentimes it's reactive, and then like, okay, oh hey, this one wave is done, so like, okay, we did stand down this month, and like, it looks all good, all clear, guys, and then like you don't hear about it again for a year until there's some other thing, But yeah.
All right, man. Hey, thanks for the time. I gotta run, but love you. Take it easy, all right?
Bud. I love you, man. We'll see you.
All right. Yep. Bye.